The Imperial Fist's fleet fragmented under the attack. Flame-wreathed battle barges pulled back, trying to outpace the guns of the Iron Warriors. Heavy cruisers staggered their flight, first one taking fire, then the next, while faster strike cruisers tried to cover the heavier warships as they pulled away. As the Golden Fleet broke into pieces, the Iron Warriors continued to press forwards. Smaller ships crippled targets, and then larger ships delivered the killing blow. It was methodical and merciless, like a siege drill eating through rock. Directly in the path of the Iron Warriors, a lone battleship turned to meet its enemy. Forgotten hands had made the oath of stone under the light of a sun far from Terra. It had been old before it served the Imperium. It had aged in scars and honors since. Its guns blazed, filling the closing space between it and the enemy with fire. Its target was a grand cruiser that bore the name Steno. The Iron Warrior's ship faltered, its void envelope peeling back as it pushed forwards through the storm of fire. Lance beams spat from the Oath of Stone, and suddenly the Steno was burning, a glowing gouge running from its spade-shaped prow to its fins. The Oath of Stone surged forwards to finish the kill, but the Steno was only one ship amongst a closing fist of iron. 3 heavy cruisers fired. Energy crackled across the Oath of Stone, void shields as they burst like oily bubbles. Shells and missiles hammered into the old ship. Its armor cracked and glowed. Crenellated gun towers sheared off, scattering clouds of stone and metal in their wake. 100-meter armor plates flaked off its hull. Deep inside, the hull fire ran between compartments, suffocating those it did not burn. Trailing wreckage, the Oath of Stone continued to close and fire on Steno. For a moment, it seemed as if it would face down the might of an entire fleet and survive. Then a line of turbo-laser fire cut its engines in two. Buildings-sized thrusters fell away as explosions kindled in the wound. On its bridge, a human officer stood. Blood covered his face and chest. He looked at the armored corpse of the ship's master. The Imperial Fist had died with his hands still gripped the arms of the command throne. The man nodded as if to someone who was not there and gave a single order to the surviving crew.
Taking heavy damage!
With the last of its momentum and guttering engine's power, the Oath of Stone rammed the Steno. It hit the grand cruiser in the belly, its prow ramming through the iron ship's spine. The Steno shuddered, transfixed like a fish on a spear. Gas and fluid sprayed from its hull. For a moment, the two spun on, locked together in death. Then the Oath of Stone prow ripped free of the Steno's hull and pulled the guts of the grand cruiser with it. Discarded and dying, the Steno drifted on, turning end over end, like a broken spear thrown at the night sky. The rest of the Iron Warriors' fleet did not even slow down. His master was staring at the lights of battle as Berossus approached. The Iron Blood had no viewports. There was no need for them, or so Berossus had heard Perturabu say. Why would you need to look at the void? War in space was a matter of calculation, sensors, and firepower. That, or hacking your enemy apart in spaces so small you could smell their blood. Windows onto the void were a weakness indulged for vanity. In spite of this sentiment, Berossus found his master on the deck of the launch bay, as its blasters opened wide to the vacuum. Thin layers of frost covered the deck and walls and had crept up Perturabu's armor. Berossus knelt, his breath loud inside his helm. He was aware that being adjutant to the Primarch for this battle held danger as well as honor. He would never claim to understand the Lord of Iron, but he wondered if at any moment his master needed to see the reality of his fleet hammering the longed-for rebuke into the flesh of Dorn's sons. It was a triumph, but Berossus knew that his master had never been more dangerous than at that moment. He could feel it like a razor lying on his skin.
Is the fleet fully deployed?
Ecstatic laced Perturabo's voice.
Forex says that full deployment will be complete in 27 minutes.
Perturabo turned to look at Berossus, the green slot eyes of his helm glowing above the plough-shaped snout. Berossus swallowed, even though he knew that the estimate was precisely in line with Forex's previous calculations. Around the Ironblood, hundreds of warships followed in close formation. Behind them, hundreds more pulled themselves from the warp to add to the Iron Warriors' fleet. Months ago, scout units had captured details of the Imperial Fist's fleet, each capturing a single snapshot of data and pushing it into the mind of the astropath slaved to each machine. The Psyker's death screams had cut through the storms, carrying dream images of the Imperial Fist's fleet. They had used the data to plan, and that plan was a timetable for obliteration. Berossus knew that the battle was progressing as intended, but under his master's gaze he wondered whether that was enough. Perturabo turned his back to the view. A gesture. The blast doors began to shut over the flyer's battered vacuum.
Tell Grog to push the vanguard harder. The rest of the fleet can vanish with what leaves.
Berossus averted his gaze and knelt even lower as Perturabo spoke.
Yes, Master. Scour the Imperial Fist signals. Find messages and marks.
Perturabo pulled his helmet off as the blast doors sealed and the atmosphere hissed into the hole. Berossus glanced up and wished he had not.
Yes, Master,
he said, his gaze again on the frost-sheen deck.
He is to be found, not killed.
Rasped Perturabo.
His death is mine.
The killing continued with murderous rhythm. The ships at the front of the Iron Warriors' fleet had begun to split into groups to hunt smaller Imperial Fist ships. Behind them, fresh arrivals advanced in a tight block. These were the macro vessels, vast cliff-sided ships filled with battalions of Iron Warriors and thousands of slave troops. Beside them lurked the Hell Burners, old system ships, orbital haulers and tugs. They had ridden through the warp on tethers behind the macro ships. Unstable plasma fuels and munitions filled each of the ramshackled craft. Their slave crews, lobotomized into blind obedience, drove the Hellburners into the throats of the Imperial Fist's guns. Many detonated before they reached their victims, but more did not. Chains of explosions formed a glowing nebula that hung in the void like lava clotting in water. The Imperial Fist ships that emerged from these infernos were half dead, their armor peeling from their superstructure, their weapons blind. The macro vessels poured boarding craft onto the crippled ships as they limped from the firestorm. The Imperial Fist crews did not die swiftly. Swamped by thousands of slaves, they held until the Iron Warriors came to finish them in person. Dozens of ships died this way, gutted from within and left to drift, their insides filled with the dead of both sides. To the Iron Warriors, the process of victory had begun, and the only question was how long it would take to complete. The first sign that all was not as it seemed was a bright explosion on the trailing edge of the Iron Warriors' fleet. The Imperial Fist cruiser Veritas and a destroyer wing cut towards their prey. Their target was a grand cruiser, a hulking brute named Calibos. The destroyers released a spread of fast-running torpedoes towards the Iron Warriors' ship as they closed. They tried to evade but turned too slowly. Blisters of fire opened along its dark metal bark. The destroyers accelerated past the injured ship. The Calibos listed drunkenly, its course veering as the rest of the fleet pulled away. The Veritas struck an instant later, its dorsal cannons crumpling the Calibos' shield and punching through its carapace. Half dead, it tried to turn its prow towards its attacker. The Veritas raced past, broadsides raking the Iron Warrior ship. The Grand Cruiser exploded in a shockwave of energy and atomized matter. As the Iron Warrior's fleet responded, the Veritas and its strike group was beyond its reach and turning for its next attack run. It was the first blow of many. It is a truth that to stand at the heart of a battle is to see it only through a narrow slit. You see the gross shift and swell of destruction, and the tide of battle submerges all the small moments of death and heroism. The deaths of thousands become only texture to a greater picture, details that you cannot look at because if your attention slips it might mean total defeat. Command breeds callousness. To say otherwise is ignorance. For me, the battle was a blur of decisions, of losses and victories rendered in impersonal information and abstract projections. I existed above the fray, a set of eyes that saw and hand that remade what was seen. And what I saw was that we were winning. For a moment the information almost overwhelmed me as my mind turned representation into raw reality. Silent flames stained the black void. Armored ships raked at each other with hot yellow claws. Void shields shimmered and burst. Nova cannon shells exploded like newborn stars. Attack craft spun and slid almost the greater vessels like silver fish through black water. Iron and gold hulls glowed under converging lattices of energy melted split. Dead ships drifted, breaking apart into crumbs of flame-licked metal. Another ship exploded. Plasma expanded to a bright white sphere. Golden armor turned to liquid. A frigate spun like an injured bird trailing flame. Lines of hot yellow fire found it and split it into glowing chunks. Gull-winged bombers converged on a storm-grey cruiser, warheads sliding from under their wings. Pinprick detonations flared across the cruiser's spine, carving off auger and sensor arrays. Blinded, it began to list. A strike cruiser roared towards a wide-nosed battleship, its shield slick with deflected fire. The battleship turns its flank to the strike cruiser, its gun ports like a murderer's eye. The strike cruiser rolled, curved under the battleship's belly and fired. Macro shells tore open layers of metal, spilling burning gas into cold space. A slab ship tried to turn its battered prow away from its attackers. A spread of gravitation torpedoes hit it in its flank, burrowed deep and detonated. The ship shivered as competing forces pulled at its structure, breaking armor, cracking bulkheads. For a second it drifted on, quivering as its bones splintered and distorted. Then its spine broke and it crumbled, as if crushed in an invisible fist. It was what months of planning had been for. The hundreds of hours of training. We were ready to resist and attack, but we were facing an enemy far greater than we have ever planned for. The Iron Warriors had taken losses, but their strength remained. If we had broken in the first moments, we would have died. If we tried to fight the Iron Warriors head-on, they would have slaughtered us. They knew our weakness, we theirs. They had hoped to find us unprepared, but we had not cracked after the first attack. Our defense had snapped back into place like the cogs of clockwork mechanism. It was an unfixed fortress made of moving strike groups, fading resistance and punishing counterattacks. Slower battleships drew fire, pulling Iron Warriors' ships out of formation, while on the edge of the battle sphere fast strike groups looped around through the margins of the Iron Warriors' fleet. They struck again and again, crippling, destroying, trimming ships from the edge of the enemy fleet like flat card from meat. As I saw a retribution unfold, I think I may have allowed myself a grim smile. The Halicon dived through the battle storm. Its leaf-blade hull glowed with reflection light from explosions and weapons fire. The void was thick with debris and plasma clouds, tumbling together like blood and entrails sinking through water. The Halicon fired as it dived, prow and dorsal weapons thrusting ahead of its path. Behind it, Two of its sister ships followed, Unity and Truth. They were smaller knife blades to the Halicon's spear tip. They spun, their flank batteries spiraling and bright helix around them as they sliced through the Iron Warrior's fleet. This near to the core of the Iron Warrior's formation. The hulls of enemy ships were so close that the gunners could aim by sight. On the Halicon's bridge, Tyr watched as his target grew in size on the picked screen. He preferred to see the Void War this way, enhanced and filtered so that he could see how enemies moved, fought, and died. It made it real, as if projections and the cold clarity of tactical data robbed it of its visceral truth. His target was an Iron Warrior's battle cruiser, its hull studded with lance turrets, its prow an ugly wedge of scored metal. He knew its name, Dominator. Once, decades before, he had seen it break the Xenos lines above Calyx. Now, he watched its shields flicker and vanish under his guns. The Hacklicon's rage hammered into the Dominator's back. The Dominator turned and rolled, like a sea leviathan trying to shake free of a harpoon.
Increase firepower,
said Tyr. This is what the abstract projections lack, he thought. This. They miss the connection with the enemy, the personal. They miss the point where you look into the eye of an old ally and ram the blade into their heart. The deck lurched under his feet. A red light washed his face as warning lights filled the bridge. They were taking fire, of course. There were a dozen Iron Warrior ships so close he felt he could reach out and touch them. The Halicon and its escort were relying on raw speed and aggression to keep them alive. That and more than a little luck. Tyr thought and smiled grimly to himself. Pollux had ordered Tyr and his battle group to strike into the center of the Iron Warrior's fleet. They had lost 2 ships in these 3 passes, but killed 4 times as many. A fair exchange, thought Tyr as he flickered his gaze to pick views on his 2 flanking strike cruisers. They looked like fire arrows falling through the forest, kindling an inferno as they flew. Proximity sirens began to blare. Tyr turned back to the image of Dominator. It filled the screen at minimum magnification. He waited until the proximity alert was a desperate shrill, and then nodded to the helmsman. The Halicon rotated on its axis, swooping under the Dominator, its flank batteries firing. The belly of the Iron Warrior ship split open in a striking explosion. The Unity and Truth followed, close behind the Halicon, hammering into the gaping gut wound into the Dominator's hull. It disintegrated, plasma from its ruptured heart burning it from within. The Halicon arched away from its kill, engines clawing for speed as it aimed for the edge of the battlesphere. The Iron Warrior's battle barge came out of the surrounding swirl of battle. It fired as it came. Tyr felt the explosion shake the hull of the Halicon. Clouds of flare static filled the picked screens. The Unity vanished in a spread of detonations. Tyr could see a shape, a huge shape, slowly resolving like a cliff coalescing from mist. 15 kilometers of cold iron and battle-blackened adamantium. Cooling trays of debris spilled from her flanks to drag in her wake. Her spine was a mountain range of gun fortresses and macro batteries. Tyr felt his skin go cold. He knew her. Had seen her once long ago, when she had been an ally. She was the oldest daughter of the ship's forgers of Olympia. A breaker of fleets and planets, her name was Ironblood, and only one being had ever been her master. The Ironblood fired again, and the Truth followed its sister to fiery death. Static blinded Tyr's view. He was shouting for full speed before the picked screens cleared. Explosions chased their flight, shaking the Halicon even as it outran the Ironblood's fury.
Get a signal to Fleetmaster Pollux,
shouted Tyr over the shrieking sirens.
Tell him the Ironblood is amongst the enemy. Tell him Perturabo is here.
For a moment I could not believe the words I had spoken. The battle projections and floods of informations faded. I do not know whether I felt awe, or anger, or elation, or what I had decided. Then Tyr's voice reached me through a fog of static and distortion.
Brother!
He said, and I could hear his shock through the obscuring white noise. I refocused, the nearby battle data snapping back into my awareness. 2 more runes marking enemy ships vanished in front of my eyes. The Iron Warrior's fleet was pulling itself apart as it tried to engage us, and it bled at every turn. But that was not enough. Not enough for me, not enough for my lost brothers, not enough of blood price for betrayal.
Yes, Captain Tyr.
I said, my words reaching across the void on broken signal waves.
My orders stand. I put my 50 ships under your command.
A wash of white noise filled the pause. Tyr was thinking, judging whether to question or embrace my order. When he told me that Perturabo's flagship led the enemy fleet, I do not think he expected such a response. He was my brother, but he never truly knew me.
As you command, Fleet Master.
I nodded once as if he could see me, as if he stood next to me rather than on the bridge of the Halicon.
For Dorn and the Imperial Brother, your objective is the Blood Iron. Execute Perturabo.
Grinding silence and gloom filled the throne room. Harsh, electrical light shone across the face of the Iron Warrior's Primarch. Across oil-blackened screen, the battle played out in bare numbers and raw tactical code. His face was unmoving, impassive, but his eyes held a spark of emotion that made Berossus wary as he approached his master. As the Primarch's adjutant, he had unrivaled view of unfolding events. The insight was not heartening. The Imperial fists had rallied and were inflicting casualties. Significant casualties. The Iron Warriors still had greater numbers, but the margin was diminishing. Berossus would have said that the Imperial fists might even have the upper hand. He kept the thought to himself. The news he bore was worrying enough.
Master,
said Berossus and knelt on the bare metal deck. Perturabo turned his head slowly, his dark eyes fastening on Berossus' bowed head.
Speak,
he said, his voice a low rumble. Berossus continued to kneel, his helm held under his arm, his silent chainsaw placed carefully on the deck beside him. He swallowed.
Master, while we have identified the flagship of the enemy fleet,
Paused and ran his great tongue across his lips.
We have also identified the master of their fleet.
He chanced a look up, met the Primarch's obsidian gaze, and looked back at the floor.
It is a captain of the lower orders. Alexis Pollux is his name. Sigismund does not command the fleet. As far as we can tell, he is not amongst them.
Berossus could hear only the thick hiss of atmosphere exchangers and the rising beat of his twin hearts. The first blow hit Berossus in the chest. Armor plate and bone shattered. One of his hearts burst. The second blow hit him as he spun through the air. He hit the wall with crushing force, slid down, blood oozing out of his cracking ceramite. His body flooded with pain suppressors, but he could feel his splintered bones cut into his flesh. Blood filled his lungs and throat. He tried to breathe. Red foam drooled from his mouth and over his broken jaw. He was a bag of mashed meat, held into the shape of a man by ruined armor. Perturabo stood motionless at the foot of his throne, flecks of Berossus' blood bright on his gauntlets.
Tell Gold to find this lesser captain that stands beside us,
said Perturabo.
Execute him and throw his corpse to the void.
At the edges of the room, ears heard and carried the order away. Perturabo turned and walked back to his iron throne. On the floor, Berossus' life seeped out of him into a slowly glowing pool. They assembled in the teleport chamber. Static electric ran over Tyr's Terminator armor, sparking between him and the metal skin of his brothers. Machines surrounded them, thrumming with restraint power. He could see tech priests moving amongst them, muttering their clinking language as they made adjustments. Parchment tappers fluttered in the charged atmosphere. Focusing dishes, capacitator towers, and arrays of arcane instruments all pointed in at Tyr and the squad that ringed them. They all wore Terminator armor, their bodies bloated by thick plates of palasteel, fiber-bundled muscles, and adamantium exoskeletons. Out beyond the ring of machines, other squads clustered on teleport plates that spread through the chamber in concentric rings. Terminator armor was rare, the product of high artifice and few mechanicum forges. Amongst the Retribution fleet there were enough suits to clad 53 brothers. All of them stood in teleport chambers waiting for Tyr's word. Beside Tyr, Sergeant Timor brought his thunderhammer to rest against the snout of his helm. Oath parchment feathered the hammer's haft. Tyr knew that inside his helm Timor was speaking his oath of moment again. He felt a surge of pride. They were waiting to go into battle against another legion, against the Primarch. It was a battle none of them had ever thought they would fight, but there was no doubt or hesitance amongst them. Pollux had ordered the strike against Perturabo. They had surprised Tyr. He had thought that his brother lacked the boldness for such gambit. That this mission might be his last did not matter. That was the nature of war, and the Imperial Fist knew that death was often the price of victory. The Emperor had created them to embrace that truth.
60 seconds, Captain,
said a voice in Tyr's ear. Tyr recognized the tones and one of the human bridge officers. The man's voice had clipped edge, an indication of focus and strain, thought Tyr. It was to be expected. Outside the hull of the Halicon, the Inferno-kissed void fled past them. Flanked by a dozen strike cruisers, they were plunging into the heart of the battlesphere. In front of them, frigates and destroyers converged on target vessels close to the center of the Iron Warriors' fleet. By now they would already be engaging the enemy, wounding with nova strikes, spreading drifts of torpedoes to find what targets they could. Tyr had little doubt that the destroyers would not survive. He had said as much to their commanders when he outlined the plan. None had questioned their orders. They all knew the value of what they attempted. If they could inflict enough damage, they would draw the Iron Blood into the engagement. After that, the second element would strike from below the axis of battle. 15 warships would attack the Iron Blood's escorts, killing where they could, and drawing fire where they could not. Its attention engaged and its escorts crippled, the Iron Blood would be open for the Halicon and its strike group. They would deliver the troop payload, 1,300 Imperial Fists loaded into boarding torpedoes and Stormbirds and waiting in teleport chambers. It was wasteful and brutal, but it had a chance of succeeding. It must have worked so far, thought Tyr.
30 seconds,
said the voice again. Tyr clicked in acknowledgement and opened a general communication channel to the rest of the strike force.
Brothers,
he said. Across the chamber all movement ceased. His words would take longer to reach the squads on the other ships, but when they did, hush and stillness would speak through the launch bays and crew compartments. He had not considered what he would say. All his life had been war. Every moment since he had left the hive shumps of North America had been training, fighting, and pushing forward the bounds of the Imperium step by bloody step. He was not a man made to craft words, but they came to him then, as if something long wasted within him stirred to life.
We're fighting a war, not a war of conquest, not a war we were made to fight, but a war for the oaths we made and the blood we shed to make the Imperium. We will never see the end of this war, but if by our deeds we can bring that end a step closer, if our deaths cost the enemy 100-fold, then the future will remember us.
He paused, felt the eclectic charge thickening against his skin. The machines were keening. Arcs of garish light played over the platform. Tyr brought his bronze-headed mace up to his faceplate and closed his eyes.
To the glory of the Primarch and the Emperor,
said Tyr. The machines howled. A rolling flash of sickly light filled his vision, and oblivion took him. The cry made me turn. Kalyolazek lay on the white marble of the command platform in a pool of his green robes. The last time I had seen him, he had seemed on the edge of death, but somehow he had managed to walk to the bridge. I moved towards him, the projection of Tyr's attack on the Iron Blood momentarily forgotten behind me. The old man was shaking. Flesh blood ran from his eye sockets, repainting over brown strains. His lips were bright with red in a parchment-pale face. His silver-tipped cane rattled on the smooth marble as he tried to stand. He slipped and started to fall again, and I caught his arm as he fell. Lezek was feather-light, but I nearly dropped him as I touched him. It felt as if I had plunged my hand into hot acid. I blanked the feeling out of it and lifted him slowly to his feet. Deck officers and attendants were clustering around now. Behind me the battle spun on, forgotten and unattended. "Master Lezek," I said. He did not reply. His body was shaking, fingers opening and closing. A thick red trickle ran down his chin. His lips were moving and a wheezing sound was coming from his mouth. "Master Lezek." I tried again, but he did not seem to know that I was there. "Kalyo," I said, and his head turned.
I can feel it. It reached toward us.
He grasped.
I can see it, coming through the storm. Terra is burning.
He moaned and shivered.
How can such...
But the question died in his throat. His head arched back. I heard a crunch of bone. His mouth opened as if he was screaming, but he made no sound. White, hot pain filled my hand where I had his arm. He lifted off the floor, his flesh glowing from within, as if his blood was on fire. He looked like a carcass suspended on a hook, arms and legs still twitching as they dangled. My grip broke, and the palm of my gauntlet was dark red with heat where I had held him. Ash fell from the old man, hair and silk charring and flaking from skin. A roaring sound spilled out of Lezek's mouth like air sucking through a furnace grate. A booming, hollow voice came from the burning man, speaking the message that was killing him.
Sons of Dawn, return to Terra. Return immediately. This is the will of Rockodorn, Praetorian of Terra.
Lezek's floating body shimmered as if I was seeing it through the heat haze. His head snapped up, his empty eyes fixed on me. For a second I thought that he was trying to tell me something, that he was trying to give me another message in that blind look. Then he spoke again.
Return to Terra. This is the will of Rockodorn.
His lips blackened. A bright yellow flames poured out of his mouth and wreathed his head. His thin flesh blistered and boiled. For a second he was a black silhouette of a man at the center of an inferno. Then the shape collapsed into a heap of embers and the flames vanished. My mouth was dry. Return to Terra. This is the will of Rockodorn. The words felt leaden, like chains fastening around my hands. I half heard the shouts of bridge officers and the mechanical sound of servitors moving to douse the remains of Kalyolazek that still smoldered at my feet. Word from Terra. Astropathic messages require careful interpretation to sift meaning from the mystery of their dreamlike content. They can take days and even then not be clear. For a message to imprint so clearly and directly onto Lezek's mind, it must have held staggering power. We had waited months for a message, for any message. Now we had it, and it felt like a judgment of execution. I glanced back to the hollow projection where our fleet and the Iron Warriors met in battle. We were winning, I thought. We could deal a wound to the enemy too severe that Iron Warriors might never recover. This is the will of Rockodorn. Withdrawal. Flight. The price would be terrible, and even then those that did survive would be running to find a storm's grave in the warp. A human serf officer moved towards me, saluted. It was one of the communication officers. Interface cables ran from the base of his skull to a sliding track on the roof above. His eyes were green-slit augmentics. I nodded an acknowledgement.
My lord,
He said, and I could hear the edge of fear in his voice.
reports from all fleet elements. Most of Astropods are dead, few alive, barely. They all spoke the same message before they died.
I looked down at the scorched parts of marble. Yes, we received the same message. To punch through the warp storms and kill a fleet's worth of astropod, the message must have been less ascending, more a tidal surge of psychic energy. No matter how it had reached us, the message was undeniable, its meaning not open to doubt. Has the war reached there already? The possibility filled my mind. What if the Iron Warriors were not the only new allies of Horus? What if Terra is falling and we are being called back as the last defense? I thought of Tyr, of the force I had committed to a bold strike, and the 100 carefully balanced engagements spread across the battlefield. The message was a blow more fatal, more carefully timed than any ambush. This battle would not end quickly. We could not continue and obey the urgency of the order. There was no neat way to unpick an engagement on such a scale. Withdrawal meant sacrifice. I remembered a hand locked around mine, blood coating both. Elias's eyes looked back into mine out of the ice cold of the distant past.
Navigator Primus Bassus reports that the passage seems to have opened in the storms, though he is not sure it will last.
The words chilled me. If we were to obey, we had to go while there was a chance of making it through the storms. I saw the abyss opening below my brother, waiting, silence, and eternal. This is the will of Vrogel Dorn. I had a choice between loyalty and victory. Withdraw, and I committed us to a loss greater than anything our legion had suffered. The will of Vrogel Dorn. Alexis, my brother had said in a voice so low that it was almost lost on the wind. He was always stronger than me. His hand opened in my memory, and the darkness reached up to swallow him. Signal all fleet elements to withdraw and jump to the warp. I closed my eyes. The pain is how you know you are still alive. We are returning to Terra.